Welcome, everyone, to the Nerd Journey Podcast, episode number 160. We're joining you every week to talk IT career progression and bring you the advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers. I'm your host, John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, joined by my co-host, Nick Cordy, at NetworkNerd_. Hey, Nick, how's it going?
Hey, John, I'm doing great. We are pre-sales technical engineers with backgrounds in IT operations. We hope our career discussions will be vendor neutral, relevant across disciplines, and remain timeless. If you're enjoying our content, please drop us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with us, tweet or DM at Nerd Journey. Ultimately, we're just two nerds on a journey.
A journey to career enlightenment.
So let's take a trip.
Awesome, Nick. Hey, so we are on the third and final episode with our esteemed guest, Andy Syrewicze. What have we talked about so far?
We've built up the trilogy. In part one, we followed Andy on his journey into IT, across different industries, and into the MSP world, even into management. From there, we went to part two, and Andy set a different course for technical evangelism, moved over to Altero. He became a member of the Microsoft MVP program, and did a lot of side hustle, let's just say, to create his own role. Very interesting stuff. But today, John, it's sort of like the Return of the Jedi portion of the trilogy. We're going to hear about the struggles, but we're going to hear about the triumph. And it's all about anxiety.
Ah, yes. Hello, darkness, my old friend. Right? It's like this thing that is a recurring thing. I think Andy teased it last time when he talked about imposter syndrome, you know, when he was attending Microsoft MVP events and looking at all these like high-powered people around him, and just kind of getting to this point where he recognized that he had this issue with anxiety. You know, plot twist, you know, people at the top end of, you know, what we consider to be, you know, nerd famous, like are dealing with the exact same issues and sometimes worse. We talk about like, you know, what is anxiety and the difference between anxiety and an anxiety disorder. I think that's like a pretty important thing to distinguish. I really loved our open and honest discussion of it. It really resonated with me, as you'll hopefully hear. But let's get to part 3 of our interview with Andy Syrewicze, episode 160 in the Nerd Journey Podcast.
It's interesting you mentioned imposter syndrome. A lot of people go through that. A lot of times the imposter syndrome can cause anxiety. And that's something that you actually talked about. You talked about anxiety a little bit at the AMP Navigator conference earlier this year. I was wondering if you could share how you came to recognize that anxiety was an issue for you.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how this has played out throughout my life, the whole anxiety discussion, because growing up, I mean, even being a teenager, early adulthood, you know, my parents had always told me, "Oh, you're so laid back, Andy. You're such a laid back kid, right?" And you hear that, and you almost, as a kid, you kind of, "Oh yeah, I'm laid back. Yeah, I'm really laid back," you know, and you kind of take that on as part of your personality, right? And I think that's kind of what happened when I was younger. Now, as I started stepping through all these career changes and this career journey that we've been talking about this whole time, knowing now that I'm aware of my anxiety disorder, which we'll get into a little bit more, I'm sure, I can look back at certain stages of my career and be like, okay, that makes sense now. That makes sense. So there'd been a lot of cases in my career where you could see certain things as being, how do I want to put it? You see me as being very driven at certain stages of my career. And there are some cases where I look back and I'm like, oh yeah, I was really anxious at the time. And I would say when I was younger, I was channeling that anxiety. I was using it in a, dare I say, positive way. I would take that energy. I mean, really, it's what anxiety is, right? It's energy, right? And I would take that energy and I would, okay, what's next? Let's push, let's go. Well, that's not sustainable in the long run, right? That's not sustainable. Especially now that I know more and have learned more about anxiety over the last year or two here. But yeah, I definitely think that has been a driving factor in my career. So when it comes down to it, basically I have generalized anxiety disorder, which for those that aren't aware, you hear that description and people just think, oh, you just get worried about random stuff, right? Really what it is it means you have an excess of worry and you may not even know what it's about, which is largely the case for me at any given time. I may feel anxiety, and I think a big struggle that I had when I first became aware that I had this disorder was, again, being a IT guy, an engineer by trade. My brain is designed to, there's a problem, I'm going to go fix it, right? Well,
oh yeah.
Once I learned and identified that, hey, I do have an anxiety disorder, and I can go back and look at my life and being like, no, you weren't laid back at all. You were you were internalizing your anxiety your entire life, basically. But I would get to a point where I'd look at my anxiety and it became a problem to solve. What's making me anxious? Well, anxiety is inexplainable sometimes, most of the time, right? You may not necessarily know what's making you anxious. So I would get stuck in that process, right? Trying to figure out like what's making me anxious, which I couldn't figure it out, which would make me more anxious, and it would just build and build and build. And this was all kind of going on behind the scenes in my career up until, I don't remember when it was. At one point, I had an opportunity, and I talked about this in my session for AMP Navigator, was I had an opportunity come up to basically go work for my dream organization, right? And it was one of those situations where I knew all the right people. A new team was being created with multiple openings. I kind of sidestepped the hiring process for the most part. It wasn't one of those put in a resume, go do the official application for the job. It was like, hey, let's talk, and get on the call, have the conversation. Everything goes fantastic, right? And I don't hear anything for a couple of weeks. And when I send my chaser follow up a couple of weeks later, I just get a generic, you're not the right person for the role type of thing. When I talk about this in terms of my anxiety, this was like, how do I explain it? This was the glass shattering at that point. Throughout my career, some cracks had been made. Like I kind of had an inkling, a thought that, hey, I get really worried about stuff sometimes. And, my wife especially would be like, hey, you think you have an anxiety issue, right? She kind of, figured it out before I did. But that was the turning point. At that point in time, you mentioned earlier when we were talking about me getting let go from that manufacturer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you asked me whether or not that had an impact on my self-confidence. That time it didn't. In this particular situation, that was shattering for my self-confidence. And imposter syndrome became a very large part of daily life, I guess I would say, at that point in time, right? And I guess looking back on it now, having gone through therapy and learning about this disorder and everything later on, now I'm able to actually look and be like, hey, I was channeling my anxiety in a somewhat healthy fashion beforehand. I was doing something with that. I was pushing my career forward. At that point, kind of temporarily had lost faith in my own capabilities at that stage in life, and imposter syndrome stepped in, and instead of the anxiety pushing forward like I had been doing my entire career up until that point, it turned into a, hey Andy, let's eat ourselves type of situation, right? And so that's when, I guess to explain it simply, kind of been rambling on this one a little bit, I know, but to explain it simply, that experience, having that shot at a dream job kind of lobbed out there in a really, what I perceive to be a real easy to hit fashion, exposed this underlying anxiety disorder. Because after that, just anxiety all the time, day after day after day after day. And it wasn't until I started going and seeing professional help that I learned that, hey, I have an anxiety disorder, and all of these things throughout my life make a whole lot more sense now, and actually learned how to deal with it and manage it. That now today it's fine, right? So I rambled a lot there. I'm sure we're gonna dig into various bits and pieces of that, but I got to let you guys get a word in edgewise here.
No, I think that was very useful. I think that sometimes people don't understand, mental health disorders, and it's like, hey, I feel anxious sometimes too, and I just deal with it. Like, that's like the least useful like view that people have on it. It's like, hey, sometimes I burn the candle at both ends. It's like, yeah, but this is like a log and it's all on fire at the same time. and yeah, I'm doing some positive things with it. I'm boiling a kettle of water, I'm cooking dinner, but that doesn't change the fact that the entire log is on fire and it's going to be consumed. And
right.
Certainly we all have points in time in our lives where we're anxious, but
Yep.
not everybody has debilitating anxiety. And that's really kind of the line that mental health professionals seem to draw, where it's like, hey, if it means that you can't do your job effectively because of your anxiety, or your relationships at home are impacted by your anxiety, or you can't physically perform, just basic functions like your sleep is interfered with, or your eating, radically shifts like in an unhealthy way because of the anxiety. Like, those all point to a disorder that needs to be dealt with in the exact same way that we would say, oh, my leg is broken, I need to go see a doctor about this.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And,
go ahead.
Yeah. For some reason, we have like these like stigmas around it. Like, if somebody breaks a leg in a car accident, there's no like, broken leg,
Right.
stigma. But
I ran
like,
to
if
work
somebody
today.
says like, if somebody says that they have an anxiety disorder like that, I don't know, but maybe it's 2021, heading into 2022, and I strongly believe that is changing. But it's all part of, people like you coming forward and saying, hey, this is what this is actually like, and it's a problem, and it's different from the anxiety that you feel. Somebody without an anxiety disorder, like, here's the contrast, and here's why it's a disorder and not just a phase.
Definitely. I totally agree with all of that. And I think you said it perfectly in that I think this was even describes me a little bit before I became aware that I had the anxiety disorder, was that I'd be going along my day job and, I'm worried about something. Well, people have worries sometimes, and just work through it, right? And I've always been the type that I used to cope with it with avoidance. And avoidance could mean, hey, let's provision the SAN, or, oh, hey, there's this Force 10 switch over here that I've never touched before, and I need to set up VLANs on. Let's go configure that, right? So I would always do these things with technology to kind of distract from myself, which had the positive effect that, hey, I was learning about whatever that technology was, right? So like I said, all these years later, now I can look back at some stuff like that throughout my career and my life, and it makes a lot more sense now why I was driven to do certain things and not do others, type of thing. I used to look at the anxiety that way until, again, I went and saw, a professional, a therapist, and we started talking through all this. And, the way I always think about it is, you ever get that support ticket or go help that one user that you fix whatever for them, and they think you've done some kind of black magic. They think you've done witchcraft and solved the issue. It's this mystical, crazy thing, right? They think you're super awesome for doing it. I imagine how therapists make me feel is how IT people make those types of end users feel. Because, you start talking to a therapist about this type of stuff, and it's so weird. They'll just queue up certain thought processes, and when they get to the conclusion of the thought process, they'll say one thing, and like, your mind is just blown at the end of that. It's like, oh, so much makes sense now, type of thing. But it's going through that process, and they call out certain things, and it's like, oh yeah, okay, I guess that's not normal. All those anxious feelings I've been having, and oh yeah, I have been avoiding all of these anxious feelings all these years by diving into tech work or video games or whatever, right? Becoming aware of those things through that professional therapist process kind of brings all that to light.
That's a really, really good analogy, right? When you go and help somebody in a help desk ticket, you're not just bringing like what you think is the solution. You're bringing like the fact that you've seen, 300 or 400 different types of problems, right? And you've had all these reps, right? And you sit down with a therapist and they've had 1,000 reps, with people, and it's almost like, my favorite thing that I ever got from a therapist was, like, oh, I know that you think that you're special in this, but you're not.
Yep.
You're actually kind of a boring case of this. That was, like, it wasn't said like that, but like to understand that you, like, what you have and the way that you're feeling is solidly in the pattern of what somebody else sees day after day after day, and they know how to fix it. We can try this and this and this and this and this, and it's almost like a decision tree, like, just diagnosing like what's wrong with a computer. It's probably one of these 10 things, and people respond differently, but this happens all the time. Like sometimes, like, people's brains just work this way. I found it very comforting.
Yes, same, because I come to that realization that, oh, hey, I have this thing, right? And like you said, same thing. There's probably 10 possibilities, and these 2 are the most likely. And now, again, my IT pro brain, now there's a roadmap that gets played out, right? Now there's skills I need to go learn, right? And that's the way that I approached it was, okay, I have this thing. There are these skills I can learn that help with it. And I'm going to go learn those just like I would learn SQL or, storage spaces direct or whatever, right? It's a skill that can be learned and leveraged.
I think there's also this aspect of needing to look outside yourself and outside of those who are super close to you, to the person with the expertise in that area, right? Because I don't know what your wife noticed about thinking you had an issue with anxiety, but I'd love to hear it if you're okay with sharing. But my gut tells me that maybe, someone else who lives with us, they want to fix us and they try really hard, but they may not have the proper approach to get the response that is going to be the fix, and that ends up frustrating you and the other person.
Right, yeah. So, for me personally, I have very few what I would call external symptoms, right?
Mm-hmm.
I internalize everything. And my wife, because she's, so close to me, she picks up on all the little subtle hints and clues that I'm anxious, or the way she puts it is, I walk into a room and I exude a, what does she say? I exude a feeling, right? I just have an aura of some sort that just an energy. That's what it is. I exude an energy, right, of anxiousness, anxiety. Even my therapist, I'll be sitting there talking with my therapist, and she's sitting across the room. She's like, "Oh, you're making me anxious just sitting in here, just because they can tell, right?"
Right. You just changed the weather in the room when you walked in.
Right. And that's not the only thing. The years leading up to me becoming aware of it, I had been suppressing and pushing it down, but there were times where it would break out in certain ways, like me getting, needlessly irritable about something stupid, right? Or reacting to certain situations with in ways that were over the top, right? Things like that. Like I remember at one time where my son was, I don't know, he was probably 4, 5 years old, still kind of a little guy, right? He had, what did he do? He had kind of inhaled like, I don't know what they're called. They're shrubs, but like they're like almost like evergreen type bush, right? I don't know. I'm not a gardening person, but basically he kind of inhaled a couple of prickly needles one time while we were at a family function, and we got them out, had him blow his nose, right? Of course, he's freaking out and he's crying, right? Because obviously it hurts when you inhale a, pine tree stuff up your nose, right? Anyway, we're driving home and he, it's about an hour and a half, 2 hour drive home from where we were going. And he does what kids do in the car sometimes, just throws up, right? Poor guy, right? Anyway, in my anxiety-addled mind at the time, something terrible was happening, right? He had, inhaled it to his lungs. He was having a terrible reaction, and I just flipped out. Like, my wife is just like, he's fine, just pull over and we'll deal with it. And me, I'm, practically in tears trying to not crash the car as we're pulling over somewhere, So, I mean, it was just those types of little, that situation wasn't so subtle probably, but it was those types of signs that she kind of picked up on that ultimately led to me going and talking to someone, right?
It's disproportionate responses, right?
Exactly. And the other big part of that was the kind of the self-destructive anxiety, those anxious thoughts that started happening after missing out on that job. That was the other big catalyst to me finally going and talking to someone and, oh, hey, surprise, you have this thing.
Well, I mean, I think we can build up scabs, right, throughout our life, and like scar
right.
tissue that hides a thing, and then something comes along and rips it off, and then every little touch afterwards feels like you're pressing on raw flesh, right? And you're in the situation where you have to recover from all the wounds all at once, and we're really not set up to deal with that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's totally understandable, but to have like a professional, it sounds like you're saying that, and again, like, correct me if I'm wrong, that like a lot of your coping mechanisms, the things that you had learned to keep it internal and not expose it externally, had been kind of slowly like bleeding away. So it become more and more obvious when you were going through these periods of higher anxiety.
Definitely. And as you get older, I mean, we take on more responsibilities as adults. You have kids go to school, and jobs are changing. I mean, I would say, I'm of the opinion, and I think most people probably would be, that as we get older, we shoulder more responsibility, and there's more to be anxious about, right? Especially with the world like it is currently today, right? That doesn't help things either. But so I think it was a combination of the two. It was, one, I had been holding that 10-pound weight straight out from my arm for years and years and years and couldn't hold it anymore, right? So those scabs, like you said, were kind of chipping away. Two, they weren't enough to contain the level of anxiety I was dealing with anymore either, So yeah, something had to give at that point. And so yeah.
What would you say to someone who's not convinced that they need to go and get the help, or they don't feel comfortable going to get the help? Was there any kind of struggle in your mind that you had with I don't want to go talk to a therapist,
So what I would say was, I was always a little hesitant to go, right? Just because it's like, okay, yeah, I'm feeling anxious. Last thing I want to do is talk about my anxiety, right? So that was obviously a big part of it. But there will come a point where you're just like, okay, I don't want to feel like this anymore, right? I don't want to feel so anxious that I'm shaking out of my skin and I'm exhausted all the time. You just get to a point to where you're just done with it, right? And I remember when I called to make the appointment, like, no hesitation once I got to that point. I'm just like, yeah, I need to talk to somebody. The only other time I had a little bit of a hesitation was driving to that initial appointment, right? It's like, I don't want to talk about my anxiety, right? But having been through the process, there's nothing to worry about there. I mean, I actually, as strange as it sounds, because it actually is therapy, I found the whole process, when everything was said and done, to be very therapeutic. It wasn't easy, don't get me wrong. Obviously you talk about stuff you don't want to talk about. And there are sessions you'll have where at the time, they don't feel like they were valuable, but in the larger scheme of things, yes, they were. But to anybody who's on the fence, one, realize that you're not alone. Two, the therapy process, it works, it helps. And I'll go back and say what I said earlier. It's a set of skills that you need to learn, just like you would learn SQL or Apache or VMware or whatever, right? And it's, that would be like trying to provision Active Directory for the first time without knowing anything about Active Directory, right? You're probably going to blow something up, right? Or it's probably not working out for you. It's a set of skills you need to learn. And at the very least, if you're wondering if you have an anxiety disorder, if you go and they say you don't, well, at least you know, right? At least you have that peace of mind.
And it doesn't make you weak asking for help. It doesn't.
I would say it makes you stronger than it does weak, because you've made a decision, right? Mm-hmm. And I think I took a little bit of comfort in the fact that I had made that decision as well, too, because it's like, okay, we're moving the ball down the field at this point, right? And we have to wait for the game to play out now, right?
It's so strange in our society. Like, we don't think about technical problems this way. We don't say, oh, I'm kind of worried that there's something wrong with our backups, but if I go and check and ask an expert, then that'll make it real. And then I'll actually have a problem, right?
Right.
We won't say that about technical issues, but we will say that about physical ones. I mean, because I was originally going to say, like, we don't say, like, hey, there might be something wrong with my knee or my leg might be broken, but if I go see a doctor, then it'll be real. But actually, people do that. Like, so,
right. It's kind of funny how the human condition creates that, right?
Right.
Well, it's less visible. Like, when you see somebody whose leg is broken, normally there's a cast, there are crutches. This is stuff that you're not necessarily going to be able to see. You mentioned that you internalized it. So
yep.
Even if I worked with you every day, Andy, there's a chance that I might have never known that. Never known to suspect it. No way of knowing.
Definitely. If I had to guess, I would say there's probably only a handful of people that even suspected. One of them, my wife. I bet you if you asked my mother prior to her knowing that I had this disorder, she probably would have said no idea.
Yeah.
Probably would have said no idea.
Easygoing, right?
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think maybe one of the issues is that we conflate, maybe this is a societal thing, we conflate, if there's no external thing, then it's an internal weakness and maybe like a failing or lack of strength. Like, that is like kind of the cultural baggage that we're carrying on something like this, rather than saying like, like, oh, that person, like the bone like bent past where it could, maintain, integrity. So now it's broken. You point to somebody else and say, well, that person's generating like all these anxiety, chemicals and having like a physical anxiety reaction, regardless of whether that's warranted or not. And you don't say like that's a moral failing, but maybe either we just don't understand that that's what's going on, or it's too easy to conflate with moral, or like, I don't know, some kind of like lack of character or internal like, strength, or something like that. Oh, you just don't have grit.
Right.
Or whatever it is.
Like Nick said, it's not as visible, right? It's definitely, at least I think it was Nick that said that, but it's not as visible. And I think by and large as a society, people are finally getting over that hurdle that, hey, there is a whole breadth of mental health disorders that need to be treated just like you would a physical ailment. And, I think something you mentioned, John, while we were talking through that, kind of made me think of something else. Again, going back to the question of, for those people that are on the fence, another place where I kind of ended up that helped me make that decision was I would look back to how hungry I was early in my career, right? one of the ways that my anxiety kind of manifested after all this had gone down was I just didn't feel hungry anymore. I didn't have that passion to go learn something new or jump on this new technology, or it just wasn't there anymore. And I missed that, so effectively I was not being as effective as I could be. I was like a sand that was running in a degraded fashion, right? I wasn't putting out as many IOPS as I could. So I'm like, hey, I need to go fix myself, learn how to fix myself, or at least it being a disorder, you can't fix it, but at least learn to operate in a way that I can get back to where I was, right?
Mitigate.
That was exactly, mitigate.
You're eliminating operational complexity or driving
Correct.
it out, right?
Exactly. That's right. That's exactly it.
Speaking of that, this is a great segue to the question we wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Can you share some of the strategies that you use to help drive out operational complexity as it relates to anxiety that have worked for you? Maybe that would help someone else who's listening.
Yeah, definitely. So for me, it's different for every patient, right? But for me, a lot of the things that work really center around the concept of mindfulness, actually playing out my anxiety, trying to figure out, again, is there a cause for it? If so, what is it? Is there anything I can do about it? If yes, go do that thing. If no, accept it and move on. Or more frequently, what happens with me, hey, I'm anxious. What am I anxious about? I don't know. Oh, just accept that. Again, anxiety sometimes is inexplainable. Accepting that and being okay with it. That was a big hurdle for me, was accepting that sometimes I'm not going to know what I'm anxious about, and that's okay. So kind of playing through that thought process is one thing that helps. Another thing that's helped me over the years is if there's a particular situation where I'm feeling a very high degree of anxiety and it's preventing me from doing whatever it is I'm trying to do, right? Whether that's write a blog post or finish a video or whatever, there's just a quick little exercise that's helped me over the years called 5 senses. And that is, okay, what are 5 things in the room that I can see? Okay, what are 4 things that I can touch? Okay, my desk, my keyboard, my mouse, monitor, whatever, right? Okay, what are 3 things I can smell? Just kind of going through all of your senses. And really what that does is kind of pulls your mind from where your anxiety is and kind of pulls you back to, I'm here right now, I'm safe, everything's okay, I'm working on what I'm working on. So that's just kind of another exercise. And then finally, one thing I try to do on a daily basis, I'm not always successful, but I always just kind of do like a journaling exercise just to kind of, hey, what went well today? What am I happy about today? What didn't go so well, right? So kind of be a little bit objective with it as well. So kind of a lot of those types of things kind of help me specifically. Now, again, you go start working with a mental health professional, they may have other options. Other things might work for you. They may have to bring medication into the equation, right? Again, there's that playbook, right? Like we do with any IT related problems, but those are the ones that work for me.
Oh man, I don't know why, but that trigger, like just bringing up medication triggers so much in me. Like there's another cultural thing there, right?
Right.
It's like, oh, if you could just take a pill and fix it, then there was, I don't know, like a bigger problem, or it wasn't a real problem, or was the easy way to deal with the problem, right?
Right.
Which we don't say about like, oh, you have an ulcer, like you're taking this medication for the ulcer.
Right.
It's like, oh, you just took the easy way out with that ulcer. Like you really should have just like gutted it out. That was an unintentional pun.
Let it eat through your stomach? Sure, why not?
Yeah.
Right. But I also like what you said about just kind of the general mindfulness, although it's too easy to say be mindful and not realize that there's like a ton of skills around that.
Oh,
and,
yes.
And very specific training that you probably need to go through. Like, I mean, some of the deeper versions that I've, read about have been like very specific types of meditation or like biofeedback, or even as simple as like having a healthy diet, like which is like a different form of like external mindfulness of like
Right.
not just like unconsciously eating or like this makes me feel good so I'm going to do it. Is like, no, this is what I need to be healthy, so I'm going to eat this because it feeds my, you know, body, soul, and mind.
Yeah.
Like that is a form of mindfulness. Or, you know, for different people, types of exercise or yoga or, those different types of things. But just a really fascinating series of things that you said that just unlocked a bunch in me that it just, very fascinating. Sorry, no question, just an observation.
Yeah. No worries, no worries. And that makes me think about a few more things, you know, that I do myself. I mean, I'd always had kind of an interest in kind of the whole Buddhist and Zen culture, that community itself. And I always kind of found it fascinating throughout the years, something calming about it, which, you know, really both of those communities rely heavily on mindfulness, right? So then it was really interesting when I got into this whole part of my life dealing with this anxiety disorder, that a lot of those things start coming into the equation as, you know, potential ways of dealing with the anxiety, right? So it was really interesting. I don't know. It just makes me wonder sometimes if like subconsciously I knew, and that's why that stuff was so interesting to me to begin with. You know, you mentioned meditation. I will do that occasionally. The Calm app, if you don't have it or if you've never tried it, is one of my favorite meditation tools.
It's a great app.
It is. And I will use it occasionally. The one that I probably use the most often is there is a meditation session, I guess you would call it, in there called Panic SOS. So if I'm in a mode where I'm like, okay, I'm stuck, I can't do anything because I'm just, you know, feeling panicked, super anxious, that one session really, really helps a lot. And it takes some practice. I mean, you're not going to sit down and instantly find value in meditation. It feels really weird at first, but it does help after you've done it for a while.
Yeah, that's like saying, oh, I need to be more healthy, I'm just going to go for a run. And then like you feel bad after, 3 minutes of running and you're like, oh, running must not be for me.
Yes, very much so. Yep.
And the Calm app, I'll just say, if anybody's worried about meditating and it being really weird, it's not like hang your chi on the ceiling before you start. It's here's someone telling you exactly how to breathe, trying to help you focus and be present right now. And that kind of breaks that loop of doom that you're talking about.
It does. It really does. Because what I learned through this whole process was I was very rarely living in the here and now. I was always, again, I think back to Yoda in Star Wars, right? His mind never on where he was, what he was doing, right? I was always like, hey, I wonder how the EMC sand runs. I wonder what kind of raid levels it. I was always thinking about something else, something technology related or some video game thing, right? I was never experiencing right now, or very rarely experiencing right now. And that's one thing that learning about this disorder, learning how to deal with it has really helped me with. Is the best way I can describe kind of like the big benefit of that is there's a lot of people you would talk to who would not be able to sit with themselves in a room for an hour with nothing to do, right? I don't know many people that could do that. I have no issues with that whatsoever, like at all. And it's like I'm completely okay just being here and now with myself now after learning all these skills I've learned over the last year or two. So that's been immensely beneficial.
That's a big symptom, right? Is like the recognizing the avoidance. Right. And a lot of times you focus on other things instead of the here and now because of the here and now is painful, right?
Yep.
Which is a sign that maybe something needs to be, I should not use the passive voice. It's a sign that maybe you should go and do something about that, like address it, just like it was a technical problem or a broken leg.
Hey, there's something funny in that log. Maybe we should go check it out.
But if I look, then it'll be real.
Right.
Well,
we don't do that.
And John, this actually goes back to something we were talking about in our Deep Work series, where if you have 5 minutes till your next meeting, it doesn't mean you should go check Twitter or LinkedIn. You could actually be present in the here and now for a few minutes and prepare your mind for that.
Yep.
That's what I thought of.
Something you said about the meditation apps, and the Calm apps, there's a whole family of apps like that. And they're all based on, kind of the theories behind what's called cognitive behavioral therapy,
Yep.
which, very often is this, is probably too complex or, it's the overly simplified way of talking about it is, mindfulness and paying attention to like the physical reactions that thoughts cause and then breaking that cycle. And people, maybe need to understand that, therapy comes in different schools. There's kind of like the old school talk therapy, which, is like,
Right.
tell me about your mother, right? That's like very rarely practiced anymore. It's mostly cognitive behavioral, which is, what is the physical reaction that you're having? And like, is that healthy? What is it that you need to do to what causes you to have that physical reaction? And then what is it that we do to like kind of break out of that cycle? Like that is kind of practical advice, almost like you would get from like a rehab, therapist, right? It says, okay, your knee hurts when you do this. That's because these muscles here have been underutilized and you have lack of flexibility here. So here's some exercises to like, fix those things to mitigate the problem. And, maybe your knee has been damaged, but we can work around it and get that flexibility back and minimize the pain, which is exactly what therapy is, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. It's a whole set of skills that it's funny, now that the curtains have been pulled back, and I know about them. It's like, I think I said this to my wife at one point in time. It's like, why are they not teaching these skills to kids in like high school?
No kidding.
Like it's after you've become educated and you have that kind of emotional maturity, right, that you gain from some of those mindfulness skills, it just becomes so clear, like you almost kick yourself, like, why didn't I do this sooner, right? Because they, at least for me, they are that helpful.
Well, we only teach them to people who are a problem. So if somebody is hyperactive, then they get diagnosed with, hyperactive, and attention deficit disorder, and then they get the tools to deal with that. Or somebody is, acts out in class and, has, or does super poorly because of like, visible anxiety, then we divert them into programs where they get taught these skills. But the fact is that the skill is useful for everybody, whether or not you have like a disorder. Like you're going to have times in your life where you have high anxiety, and man, wouldn't it be great if you had the skills to deal with that? Just like, hey, you're, not everybody, is a professional swimmer or a fisherman, but hey, wouldn't it be great to know how to swim? Like just in case, like you got
just
dunked.
in case, right?
Just like the same reading methodologies for people with dyslexia are actually better than some of the others that are taught in mainstream, Same deal.
Yeah. Man, Andy, this has just been so eye-opening. I really feel like this has been like a terrific conversation. Is there like a place that you've like written about this other than AMP Navigator? Is that something that you kind of document and put out there?
So AMP Navigator was kind of my first dip toe in the water on this particular subject with the public. So you guys in this podcast, this is the second time I've talked about this publicly. I was a little touchy for a long time on whether I was going to talk about it publicly or not. But like you mentioned earlier, John, there's this societal view on mental illness, and I look at myself and the skills I've gained over my career, them being public speaking ability and the ability to write and tell a story. I almost felt like, okay, hey, I need to go talk about this and do something with it, right? So that said, I haven't officially launched it yet, but hopefully by the time this is published, I'll have to give you guys the URL. But I've started working on a Substack that focuses all around my experiences with anxiety and kind of weaving in the technical discussion as well. So kind of weaving in some tech inside of that discussion. So like one of the articles that I've pre-prepared for officially launching it is mindfulness journaling using VS Code. So that's like one of the first.
That's right up John's alley.
I love VS Code. VS Code is great. There's it's an extension, VS Code Journal, which basically adds in hotkeys in VS Code, so you can easily open up markdown entries, and it will automatically create a folder structure for you based on month, day. I'm getting ahead of myself. Year, month, day. There we go. So it automatically creates that folder structure for you. And so, yeah, I basically talk about kind of all that and how you would do that using VS Code. So trying to bring my two worlds together, I guess, right? That is, teaching people in tech how to deal with anxiety, right?
Which could lead to your next career. I mean, I'm sitting here going, man, that could be your next thing.
Maybe that would be fun.
I mean?
I don't know anybody who's looking for a anxiety or a technical guy that can do marketing and has experience in dealing with anxiety, but stranger things have happened.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and, like we're gonna look out for that. It's
yes,
I believe Annie's Anxiety Blog .substack. No, that's not true.
I haven't come up with a name for it yet. I thought about anxiousmusings.substack.com, but I don't know if it fits yet. So this is bringing in the whole branding and marketing side of my skill set now. So
you got to get your SEO right. I mean, we don't want to interfere with that.
Make sure you know who the audience is, right? You have
that's right. That's right.
Got to make some personas, and we'll figure out who it is.
But even if it doesn't launch by the time this episode airs, let us know. We'll make sure and announce it on the show as a resource for people. Definitely want to advertise that.
Appreciate that. Yep, definitely. I'll that's is on my to-do list for the holidays here. But
lovely.
We'll hopefully get that launched here soon. I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome. Andy, thanks so much for your time this evening. I just have found the entire conversation just incredibly valuable, from your career arc to even, discussing anxiety and opening my mind to a couple things and drawing lines between things, some new conclusions. Really enjoyed it.
It's been great. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you guys. Like I said, I've been familiar with your guys' podcast before, so it was really exciting to come on the show and I'd be a guest myself. So I really appreciate the opportunity. And I want to say thanks also for, kind of bringing awareness to this topic, right? We've talked about it a few times. I think as a society, we're coming around to mental illness, but we still got work to do, right? And I think it's great that you guys are spending an episode on this, right? So I really appreciate that.
I mean, it's a story that we saw and heard that needed to be told, and that's what we wanted to do. So we appreciate your willingness to share, Andy, and for spending the time.
Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, and good night. Oh, wow. So like I said during the intro, I really loved the open discussion of anxiety. And, that can be just a really difficult thing to expose to the world. It's like, you're being vulnerable. So I really, appreciate Andy coming on and talking about that. I loved hearing about all the resources. I really hope that listeners don't take the list of tools and, and methods that we went through as a reason to not get professional evaluation and not get professional help. If you suspect that anxiety is a problem for yourself, like do like the hard thing, which is, raise your hand and say, hey, maybe I need some help here. And that's just like an evaluation, right? Just, I think one of the things that I kind of tripped over when I was thinking about this was we don't treat evaluations of our technology stack or the readiness state of our enterprise systems this way. Like, hey, I don't want to look at it because if there's a problem, then the problem's real. It's like, no, you kind of need to know if the problem is real because, it's kind of, you can't fix the problem until you know it's real. You can't work towards fixing it. And not knowing if it's real doesn't avoid additional anxiety about the possibility of it being a problem. So just really hope that, people, take this opportunity to do a self-evaluation, go, hey, maybe I need to think about this. Is anxiety something that is interfering with my ability to live my life? Is depression or sadness something that is interfering with my ability to live my life? And, anything that you might be dealing with, if it's interfering with your life, like that's kind of where it becomes like a problem as opposed to just what everybody else is dealing with. That's a little bit long-winded, but let me throw it to you, Nick.
These things that other people can't immediately see and may not understand, I feel like we all have a sense of pride, at least a little bit, about getting help and what that means to go and ask for help with this problem that only I can feel or only I can see. And it's just not easy to do that and accept that you need to do it. And I know that Andy gave some great points on why you should get the help you need. So I hope that if you were on the fence before listening to this, that you'll really think about doing what you need to do, do what's best for yourself.
Yeah,
and those
absolutely.
around you.
Yeah, especially for the benefit of those people around you. I mean, not to mention yourself, right? Just living a better life, a more enjoyable life, a more fulfilled life, dealing with any kind of mental health issues that you have. And that can be as simple as getting evaluated, right? And you might go through an evaluation process and a professional goes, hey, you know what? This is kind of, doesn't rise to the level of where we'd say you have a disorder. It's something we keep our eyes on, but you might want to take some of these steps to kind of deal with things and, lower your levels of anxiety or, improve your mood so that you're not angry all the time or as much or, whatever, it is that you happen to be dealing with. Just that evaluation, will de-stress a lot of this, right? Somebody goes, hey, we think you have an issue here and here's how to deal with it. At least you've gotten that evaluation. I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again. So
no, it's good because what you've pointed out here, John, is that the coping strategies that Andy pointed out are very practical, even for people who don't have a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. Even
right.
in times of periodic anxiety, the kinds of things he was talking about can help us all.
Yeah. And it's, I think, kind of cool to be able to listen in on the help that somebody else got. It's kind of like listening to, somebody talking about like coaching that they got in a sport, right? Like talking about a golf swing. Hey, my golf instructor said, hey, I need to do this and do this. And the goal is this, in order to have a smooth swing, I needed to, not do this. I needed to emphasize this. And I think that's great. And we can kind of take that like, oh, I see my overall goal is X, because that's kind of all of us. And that's kind of a generalized coaching idea, but taking exactly what somebody had and making it personal to us is a mistake because we might not have exactly the same, issue that person has. So again, yet another reason to kind of go get evaluated. If you think this is an issue, if you suspect it's an issue, figure out and then get some, personal coaching, just like you would for, a physical disorder, right? If you're limping too much, if, my elbow hurts when I do this, tell me what to do. It's the exact same thing.
I think we just keep touching on this idea of the need to be present. Even though episode 140 with Eric Brooker wasn't necessarily about anxiety, that's what I thought of when Andy started talking about these strategies are to help you come back to the present. And when Eric took his vacation, right, he had some anxious feelings before, but he took the time to be present, and you saw all the benefits he reaped, and you're hearing about the benefits that Andy reaps when he leverages these strategies to come back and be present. I just think that there are so many benefits to making ourselves, forcing ourselves, maybe the best word is enabling ourselves to be more present.
Yeah. I really like this idea of being present. And I think we've talked about it before too, right? Kind of like the stories that we can tell ourselves about the past and the future, like being one mode that our brain can be in, and actually being present and paying attention to what's going on in the here and now as being a different mode. And you can't really be in both of those modes at the same time. So if you're, worrying about the past and all the things that have gotten you here, or you're worrying about the future and where things could go, you are not paying attention to the present and where you are right now. So that, if you just have the inability to be present, then that could be like a major clue that maybe you should go get evaluated. So hope everybody has like a good takeaway from this. And, if this is not something that you worry about or deal with, hopefully there's some like cool strategies for those like kind of acute or emergency situations, as opposed to like if you have a chronic condition. Still helpful.
For other episodes, I like the ones that had a special guest, John Tolles, 129 and 130, talked about ADHD.
Oh,
that was a great series to go back and reference. I'm sure there are other challenges that we've talked about that, we're just not thinking of at the moment. But
no, you're absolutely right. Because like in that category of like neurodiverse as opposed to neurotypical, like, there's a lot of parallels. It's not exactly the same, but there's a lot of parallels. Like especially if you're afraid to get diagnosed and afraid to start, dealing with the issue of like, how your brain works if you do have this diagnosis. That's a really good call out. Thanks, Nick.
Sure thing.
Anything else before we get out of here?
I think that's it. Great trilogy. Really enjoyed that one. Make sure you follow Andy out in the community. We'll put the links in the show notes. I'm sure he's going to be writing about anxiety like he mentioned in this part 3 of the interview. So definitely check that out. Just a reminder, we want people to subscribe and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. We want to know if we're being helpful and are always looking for interesting questions to ponder. We're collectively on Twitter @NerdJourney.
All right. Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White @VJourneyman. For Nick Cordy @NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.